Hollywood has this kind of mythical portrayal of the heroic person who doesn't experience any fear. It took me a long time to come to realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but it's resourcing yourself in the face of fear.
Part of the challenge of when to act courageously, how do you know when to stand up and when not to?
In the book, I talk about courage as a muscle. You gotta build it one step at a time. And courage, I think, is the unlock into taking bold, decisive action in the face of uncertainty.
Today, we're going to take on a very interesting topic. It's the topic of courage. We're joined today by Harvard Business School professor Ranjay Gulati. He's a best-selling author of the book Deep Purpose, and most recently, How to Be Bold, the Surprising Science of Everyday Courage. He's advised CEOs and organizations large and small around the world on building cultures that don't just perform, but transform. What I love about Ranjay's work in this new book is that he treats courage as a learnable skill, something any of us can build, one decision at a time. And I find that fascinating because we often think of courage in a fairly narrow way. We think of extraordinary, superhuman bravery. But Ranjay is actually going to help us understand the everyday science of courage. And so, really excited about that. Ranjay, thank you so much for making the time and joining us today.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure always to be with you.
We tried to make sure we didn't build this conversation in a vacuum and that I'm just not asking you questions. And so we actually had our employees read the book. Many of them actually started to form their own book clubs. And so many of the questions you're going to hear today come directly from our employees and kind of what they were thinking about and what came out of their conversations in the book club. And so I want to talk about that. But before we do that, when you look back at your own journey, I'm curious, there's some kind of gravitational pull that made you feel like, hey, courage is something that I want to talk about personally. It's interesting to the world, but personally, I actually want to talk about that. I'm wondering, was there a moment or a personal story that led you to this space of wanting to talk about courage and breaking it down, the science of it down, so that people can access it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you always look back and ask yourself, why did I do that now?
Yeah.
And if I look back in time, this project I began 12 years ago. It was never meant to be a book. In fact, I have binders for research projects. This was called hobby project. Yeah. So my RAs and people would ask me periodically, what is a hobby project? I said, a hobby project means it has no end and I'm just doing it for the hell of it, for myself. Yeah. And I was looking at unusual characters who did extraordinary things, but also ordinary characters. And I would use them in my teaching sometimes to ask people like, what do you think of this person? I had CEOs come to my class who were involved in turnarounds and transformations. But I think my story went back much further. So my father passed away 5 years ago. I had a great relationship with him, spent lots of time with him. He lived in India. And when you go to pack up his things, I had these flashbacks of childhood stories that I had forgotten. I would see objects saying, oh my God, and they were associated with the story. So I was packing his military uniforms, and I remembered a story from when I was 10 years old. And my father had been in the military, and India had been in a rather bloody war, and he was in a special ops intelligence unit behind enemy lines. A dangerous mission. They successfully accomplished it, came back. So I was watching James Bond movies and kind of proud of my dad that he was in this kind of dangerous thing. I didn't think about the consequences.
Right.
I went to walk with my dad, and I said, Dad, when you were out there behind enemy lines, were you scared? Now I'm thinking James Bond, right?
Yeah.
And my dad, being who he was, he said, son, it was actually very scary. We were behind enemy lines. We had no supply lines, no extraction plan, and we had lost the element of surprise. So it was scary. But he said, but I had a responsibility to my country, to my people who were working and reporting to me, and to the mission. So I did it. None of that registered in my head. I was so disappointed in my dad. The 10-year-old me could only fixate on one thing. I can't believe he was scared.
Right, because you had in your mind James Bond, cool,
yes.
Collected, fearless.
Yes, exactly. So Hollywood has this kind of mythical portrayal of the heroic person who doesn't experience any fear.
Yeah.
And even Tom Cruise, who does almost all of his own stunts. People think, oh my God, he must be crazy. And this. He says, it's not that I'm not scared. It's that I've learned to be okay with being scared. And Nelson Mandela talked about this when he said the courageous person is not one who is fearless, but one who conquers fear and learns to live with it. This was a big breakthrough in my head that courage, and it took me a long time to come to for the long time I was disappointed in my dad, thinking, oh, I can't believe he was scared.
Yeah, yeah.
And it took me a long time to come to realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but it's resourcing yourself in the face of fear. So all these things came back to me that, how do these people, regular people, this is not some celebrity person, just resource themselves.
Yeah.
I also came to realize as I got into this that somebody wrote me an email after the book came out. I've got a lot of interesting emails from people. And one said, I've realized that most of us are living our life of fear, not of our dreams. Because fear just paralyzes us. It's a primal instinct that is hardwired in the primitive brain.
Yeah.
And until we know how to kind of build a relationship with that instinct and emotion, it's just going to take over our life. It took me a long time to first understand that fear is a normal response. And you got to name it to tame it, first of all.
Yeah.
So it's okay to call out saying, I'm scared. Now, you don't see James Bond saying, I'm scared.
Yeah.
So we think like, oh, how can I'm a James Bond? Come on.
Yeah.
It's okay to say, I'm scared. That's kind of scary, guys. We're going to go into a new market. We're going to embrace AI to do something we've never done before. We don't know if it's going to kill our business model.
That's right.
But you know what? We got to do it. So understanding fear, and I think I came to realize that deep down, that I had to build a relationship with fear.
Yeah.
A positive one.
Part of the challenge of when to act courageously is understanding that spectrum, I think, of cowardice to recklessness. And so, but I'm curious, how do you think about that spectrum? Because if you're courageous in the wrong moment, the results may be bad. And so, how do you know when to stand up and when not to?
Yeah. It's a great question, first of all, and a really hard one, but I think really on point. So first of all, Aristotle was one of the first to make that distinction, where when he was writing his essay about courage, he distinguished on the one extreme cowardice, and the other extreme was reckless. Yeah. He put courage in the middle. When he was looking at the ideal soldier, a soldier can be cowardly, reckless, and in between. So, courage definitely involves us to have some sense of kind of thoughtfulness about what we're doing. So let's think of what is reckless. The main difference between a reckless and a courageous person is the acknowledgement of risks and circumstances involved. Yeah. A reckless person chooses to take action without even contemplating consequence, contemplating risks, understanding the trade-offs. Courageous person takes action knowing the risks and consequences. Now, and I think it's important to understand that. By the way, I also want to say that people like me, we're opportunists. If an action works out, we say courageous.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work out, we say reckless. So we do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking like we're doing right now after the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that happening where we kind of second guess based on outcomes. But I still think, sometimes actions have negative consequences, but the person has thought it through. Let's apply it today, in today's context. Everyone's talking about kind of how AI will transform businesses. One extreme, I would say, are people who are reckless, who are just jumping in blind. Yeah. Not thinking of consequences, not thinking of action. Think everybody's doing it, I got to do it, jump right in.
Yeah.
Other extreme is let's wait. It's too early, let's wait and see, let's wait and see, let's wait and see.
Reckless cowardice.
Yes. And somewhere in the middle is people saying, let's do some interesting pilots. Here are some where proof of concept is already there. We have enough data to want to try it out. And I think it's a fine line, though, between courage and recklessness.
Interesting.
So it is a fine line.
Yeah.
But
I was interviewing Jim Harbaugh yesterday, and he's the coach of the LA Chargers, and he's known as a turnaround expert. And he turned around the Stanford program. Within 1 year, he came to the 49ers, kind of turned them around, got the NFC Championship and a Super Bowl appearance, went to Michigan, turned them around. Now he's at the Chargers. And he said, I say the same thing in the locker room every single time. And I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember exact phrase, but it was basically play hard, keep your wits about you, don't worry. And what's interesting about that to me is it reminds me a little bit of what you're saying, which is to keep your wits about you piece of it is you do have to kind of make an assessment of how can I minimize or have some control or some sense of control over the situation. But at a certain point, once you get past that, the don't worry piece is you let it go. And something beyond, whether it's faith or something else, will then guide you. But it's the combination of those two things. Am I interpreting it correctly?
Absolutely. And actually, your interpretation of how, since I happen to have written a case on Nick Saban
Yeah.
and also Pete Carroll, I really got into how these sports psychologists think about this. And your description is actually very, very succinct and right on the money. I'll just elaborate on that a little bit. So first of all, to your earlier point, historically, how have people dealt with uncertainty, where fear comes from? Ancient times, from the most ancient times, people prayed to a higher power.
Yeah.
That was a way, it was a coping system. I don't want to get all religious here or make a statement any way or the other. Some will say it works, but at minimum, it calms us down.
Yes.
And this led to one chapter in my book, which is called Calm. And it comes from a body of research called emotional self-regulation. So actually, there's a body of research on how to regulate and keep our emotions in check. What, my wife likes to say, learn to, respond, not react.
Right.
Now, how do these people play it out? In the case of pilots and surgeons, their calming system is checklists. Right? Captain Sully, when he had to land the plane on the Hudson River, with like a 2-minute decision, immediately he had a checklist.
Yeah.
And it was able to compartmentalize and focus. So I'm not thinking about noise. I'm thinking about the task at hand. Similarly in surgery. In athletics, I found interesting. What did Phil Jackson say? He said, focusing on winning is a loser's game. I never understood that at first. It sounded
Focusing on winning
is a
is a
loser's
loser's game.
Yes.
Okay.
But actually, then I understood it from Nick Saban. They call it the process. And the idea is, when he was a young coach at Michigan State, they had a key game against Ohio State, heavily favored to crush these guys. So he met this young sports psychologist at Michigan State. Somebody introduced him. He said, what should I do? He said, tell your players not to look at the scoreboard and treat each play like a practice. Just do your job. Just do your job. And that's all he did. They were down halftime by a lot. I forget the exact score, and they came back in the second half. And in the locker room, he told them, guys, don't forget. Do not look at the score. Yeah. And so how do you create that repetition and trust the process?
Yeah.
I think athletes have had learned to master this kind of emotional self-regulation. And if all of us can do that, it's a great skill to have.
Because I'm fascinated by coaches and how they actually motivate teams. Pete Carroll, is it the same as Nick Saban? Focus on the process or different?
Different. And I came to understand that too, which is that is a different kind of motivational tool you're relying on. So all of us, let's be very clear, all professional athletes are highly motivated.
Yeah.
These are people who have trained themselves and worked incredibly hard, pushed themselves to the limit to get to the highest level in their game.
Yeah.
And there's a high level of self-interest because you can get paid a lot if you play really well. You rise to the top, you're going to get paid as a pyramid payment system, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to be near the top of that game. So your incentive structure is aligned, you're self-disciplined, you're motivated. Now, how can I get you to do even more?
Yeah.
And the idea is that we will do a lot for ourselves, but we will do even more for a peer group we care about, teammates.
Yes.
We will do even more for a collective we might care about, team. We will do even more for an aspirational figure who we look up to, the coach. And so the question then becomes, who are you playing for? Yourself? Your teammates? Your team? Your coach? And if you're simply playing for yourself, you'll do really well. No question about it. But are you willing to do more in that context? That, I think, is the...
Love that. I love that. You actually touch on that in the book, actually, too, right? Which is kind of having this sense of being connected to something bigger than yourself. It can become one of the motivating forces to kind of conjure up courage.
There are several parts to that. One is if you feel connected to something bigger than yourself, right? The Marine Corps might do that. Some companies do that. Startups will do that, saying, we are here for a cause, we're trying to do that. So it's sometimes identifying with an institution that makes you do more.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's connection to an ideal. That's who I am. that principle is deeply dear to me, right? And I will do, and if I see that principle violated, I will do whatever it takes. And you see people, discovering that principle sometimes, having a belief in something or an entity creates its own animating force that compels us to do things. And it doesn't have to be some higher ideal necessarily. Some entrepreneurs are driven by, I want to change this marketplace. We want to win.
Yeah.
You know, that's also an ideal.
Yeah.
We are here to win.
What does courage look like in this moment that we're in right now where, leaders basically say, hey, I want to live to fight another day. Yeah. And so my ideals may be here and I believe in it and I want my team and my company and all the associates within the company to live this. But the pragmatism in a world that's highly polarized, I have to moderate that a bit.
It's a very difficult time for leaders right now. Because a leader's job is to create some alignment across their disparate stakeholders who want different things.
Yes.
And your job is to be able to do that. Your job is not to speak on behalf of one set of stakeholders at the expense of others. Ideally not. Ideally, you're trying to find common ground across them. And I think the courageous thing for leaders to be doing right now is look for voices of inclusion and common ground. Instead of falling into the trap of saying, I have to choose one side or another side, is to show empathy and understanding for all sides.
Yes.
And say that, look, we need to understand different points of view, and we as a business, this is where we stand. And so I think first is looking for common ground, but that's the easy answer. I think it's not so easy.
Yeah.
You still have to, at some moments in time, recognize that this is beyond what is acceptable to us.
Thank you for raising the topic of courage. We love this idea of wanting to be bold, but how do you actually do it? Is it like a threshold moment, where the clouds part, the sun shines, and suddenly I am courageous? Or is it a process? And if it's a process, what does that journey look like?
So I wish there was one answer to this and say, here's the magical single thing. And that's why the book has, 9 chapters, 6 of them at the individual level, because I found there were different ways in which people resource themselves to act with courage.
Yes.
So it wasn't one pathway, but let me give you one or two just to illustrate this point to you. So I gave one already, calm. How do you dial down the emotional response? So, Adele, before she performs, she sees looks at a picture of Celine Dion. It calms her down. Katie Ledecky, whom, was at the Olympics last year as one of your visa partners, she apparently recites her grandmother's name when she's nervous before swimming. So people have rituals, routines to stay calm. Another one that I talked about in the book is about how do you build self-efficacy.
Yeah.
And this one is about confidence. And a Stanford professor did this study, Albert Bandura, where he tried to get kids who are terrified of snakes, technically ophidiophobes, to look at pictures of snakes and eventually touch and hold a snake. And of course, in the course of his study, more than half of them drop out. The few who hang in there eventually touch and hold a snake, not just any snake, but a 6-foot-long corn snake. But what is interesting is what they say about themselves afterwards. They said, I can't believe I did it. And then they said, it changed their whole worldview of themselves.
Right.
I can do it. So that's why the study, they call it self-efficacy. And how do you develop this can-do mindset? Like, I'm sure you've seen people, some of them are always like, the first obstacle, they're like, oh my God, I can't do this.
Right, exactly.
Others are like, they're going to walk through walls and windows, whatever they have to do to get the thing done. How do you build that inner, like Captain Sully, when he was asked, you never landed a plane on water, you never trained for it, never simulated it, and looked at Katie Couric and said, I knew I could do it.
Yeah.
I knew I could do it.
Yeah. Well, let me take this down to a more kind of everyday level. Mm-hmm. So, I'm in a room, marketing meeting or business meeting, product meeting. Sitting in the back, of the room, conversations going on, and I know I want to jump in. but I'm afraid to jump in because, you know, and all sorts of things race through my head. You know, like what if I say something that's going to be interpreted as being dumb, or am I following the conference? Whatever the fear is, and so, and you can attribute it to, oh, I'm an introvert, or you know, or whatever the excuse is for not doing it. And you leave that meeting, you're like, man, I wish I would have spoken up, because the conversation was flowing in a way where I know my comment would have resonated. I look at it in retrospect. Next time I go in, I want to do better. Like, how do you build that muscle? Everyday kind of experience. It's not an extraordinary thing, because landing a plane in the Hudson is extraordinary. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a great question, actually. I love the way you kind of brought it to day-to-day life. So here's the thing is, all of us have a self-narrative. There's actually a theory called self-perception theory. We look at our own actions, and we build a theory of ourselves based on those actions, and it reinforces itself. So if you've gone to meeting after meeting where you haven't spoken up, guess what you've told yourself already? I don't have the guts. I'm not a person who speaks up. I'm introvert, I'm shy, it's too risky, I'm cautious, I'm pragmatic, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that, I'm that. And that only makes it worse. You are now always going to be that way. How are you going to break that vicious cycle? Yeah. And what is interesting is, when you break it, like these kids, their biggest fear in life was snakes. And they did it. And it unlocked every other aspect of their lives. So, you know, you've got to start small. Yes. I like to, in the book, I talk about courage as a muscle. You got to build it one step at a time. Yeah. Do it small. You don't have to go in there and stand on a table and jump up and down. Right. But you just spoke up. And then you look back at yourself. And your self-narrative is going to be, yeah, I can do this. And so much of our action is driven by this internal self-narrative that is internalized in us by observing our own selves. Right. So that's the sad part. We look at ourselves in the mirror and say, you're a wimp. Yeah. Guess what? Stay a wimp.
We learn through stories, including the stories we tell of ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to go back to something you talked about at the top of this conversation, and that is this idea of having courage starts to unfold the potential within us. And I'm curious, like, what does that actually mean?
You know, Aristotle, C.S. Lewis, Maya Angelou, and so many others have described courage as the master virtue that unlocks all other virtues. Wow. And it's really interesting that you at Visa have put courage as one of the first leadership principle out there. And I think it is a master virtue. It holds us back from doing so much. And if you link this to research done on regret, so some Cornell professors like 30 years ago did a study on regret. Yeah. And they interviewed people who had retired and asked them, like, what do you regret most in life? And people had much more regret about inaction than they did about action. Things they didn't do. And so as we look back at the arc of our life, whether it's looking backwards or forwards, I think creating that healthy relationship with fear, learning to accept fear, acknowledge fear. Now I tell myself, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. But guess what? Just because you're scared doesn't mean you're going to do nothing. Right? And so then the question is how not to live, because fear left to its own devices is going to paralyze us. It's going to cloud judgment. It's going to overwhelm the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and you can't even think straight. Yeah. So that's why when you're like in a meeting and you're like scared, you're not going to do anything. Because once the fear impulse has taken over us, I'm not going to do, it's too much. Right. And it's going to feel like too much. And then I'm going to look at myself in the mirror and say, that's you. Yeah. So don't ever try it again. So I think we have to break that logjam with small steps. I'll also add one more. Courage rarely happens alone. Most courageous people have what I call the support squad. Right. You got to build a support squad. Who are the people who give you confidence, moral support, informational support, feedback support? So courage is rarely done alone. So I think I'm not saying get out there. You should be talking to people who give you support. I mean, there's a great video of Kiala Settles who does, her audition for This Is Me. Yeah. But she was able to perform that way because she had this coach assigned to her who really kind of nudged her along. And then there was a backup singer who also gave her the boost. And so it was, so we don't do these things alone either.
Yeah, I love that. I really, really love that. And speaking of not doing it alone, one of the, I think, responsibilities of a leader of any organization is to create the conditions that allow people to fulfill their potential, whether as an individual or a team. And I'm wondering, what have you learned about what can a leader do to create that culture where people feel empowered to act in bold ways?
So, that's a really interesting tension. So we all say create psychological safety, create freedom. The problem with that is you then do that at the risk of accountability,
Yes.
right? People say, okay, I'm free, man.
Yeah.
I don't need to, doesn't matter.
Exactly.
This is like mommy's love, unconditional love.
Yeah.
And I think Netflix, which is down not far from here, they have one of their leadership principles, freedom with responsibility.
Yes.
So how do you create that? Because a leader should be able to not only create freedom, but also have people who are then willing to say, it didn't work out and I take responsibility for it not working out. And okay, next time I'll try. Now you can't have it all the time, but they also talk about they only hire fully formed adults.
What does that mean?
It's a very dangerous statement.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I was
yeah.
very, actually, when I first heard it, I was like, this doesn't sound good to me.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a bias baked into that. But they said, look, we want people who can take responsibility.
Yeah.
A lot of people want freedom, but no responsibility or accountability. And I saw, in fact, back to your leadership principles, one of them is about taking responsibility and accountability.
Yeah.
So how do we learn to balance those two? Because they seem to sometimes work in opposition. So a leader's job is to create the space for trying,
Yeah.
while also creating a sense of responsibility and accountability, and balancing the two, because otherwise they're left to their own, they will fight each other. And courage, I think, is the unlock into taking bold, decisive action in the face of uncertainty. And I want to clarify, uncertainty is not the same as risk,
Yes. Exactly.
right? Risk is where you can do the probabilities and come up with a distribution of outcomes. Uncertainty is unknown.
Yeah.
So we have a lot more uncertainty today. CEOs in last year used the word uncertainty far more often in their earnings calls than they did the previous couple of years.
Right.
Right? Everyone talks. Harvard Business Review, the editor did a special issue on courage. And the editor in her cover essay said, we are in an uncertainty crisis for which we don't have the courage to take appropriate action. So how do we resource ourselves in this uncertain environment to take bold action? Because organizations that are going to make it are going to be the ones who don't sit on the sidelines. I think sometimes we don't realize doing nothing is a decision.
Yes. Exactly.
And sometimes a riskier decision than doing something and getting it wrong.
That's right.
I'll leave you with one last thing quickly, is that one of the things I also talk about in the book is about how companies and individuals, when they walk into the darkness of uncertainty, the fog of uncertainty, take one step at a time, small steps.
Yeah.
You don't need to leap into the unknown. It's called sense making. The way a firefighter goes into a building, they don't know what's inside. They don't know when the building's going to collapse. So they form an initial hypothesis, they do 2 steps in, and then they reassess and learn, and then take 2 more steps in. What ancient mariners used to call point-to-point navigation. You didn't go straight sailing right into the middle of the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic.
Yeah.
You found land 2 days out, and then you came back.
Yeah.
Then you found land from there to the next land 2 days out.
Yeah.
So similarly, in the world of AI or tech, look what's coming our way. AI, robotics, quantum computing, there's a lot of change coming our way. Regulatory change, geopolitical change. So sometimes you have to take 2 steps in.
Yeah.
Explore. And what Carl Weick, this famous Michigan psychologist, called, sometimes you have to act your way into knowing.
Yes. Yeah.
Instead of knowing before you act.
This is a great way to wrap up. I think that message to any leader and to any individual, taking those small steps forward, I think is at the heart of this. And I got to tell you, Ranjay, the idea of how to be bold, the surprising science of everyday courage, I think the timing of it is absolutely perfect, because we are in this era of uncertainty. We're also in this era where people want to become the person they want to be, and that takes courage, because that means taking a path, not following the path of least resistance and feeling uncomfortable. And so I think your book can be helpful on an individual level and for an organization and for leaders. So thank you for making the time. Really appreciate it. Always love our conversations, and I'm glad we get to share this one with the broader audience.
Thank you, Frank. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll leave you with a parting thought, what this person who wrote me an email said. Most of us are living our life of fear, not of our dreams. And I feel like, it is courage for me, as I've learned about it, has been such a big unlock in my life. And I'm so happy to be able to share this with others who may benefit from it.
Thank you, Ranjay. I appreciate it. Good seeing you as always.
Thank you.